So later this week there's going to be a total lunar eclipse that will be visible in large parts of the Western Hemisphere, from the UK across the Atlantic into North America and beyond. And it's the first one for a little while, so it's certainly an interesting event to plan to photograph. So I thought, in preparing for this, maybe we could look at some photographs of past eclipses, and I'm planning to show you some of the different circumstances of unique eclipse events, and how the position of the moon in the sky during the time of the eclipse really can drive the types of photographs that you're likely to want to pursue. So we'll see if we can learn a little bit from past experience and then apply that to planning for this upcoming eclipse. So here's the first photograph of an eclipse that happened way back in 2010. And as I'm sure you know, that is taken in Sydney, Australia. This is the Sydney Opera House. And this is Circular Quay that we're positioned in. There's the moon. And a few things that I'll show you for the selection of shots. There's the exposure information. And of course, that's always useful to know. And I think a lot of people are interested to know what exposures tend to work for different events. And one thing you will notice is that the moon is a bit blown out. So this is not really an ideal exposure. It's good exposure for the opera house and for these lights and so forth. But this really probably needed to be captured in two exposures and then exposure blended. But back in the day, wasn't what I did for whatever reason, and we have a slightly blown out moon. However, it's not a totally ineffective shot. A few things to note about this eclipse. First of all, it was a total eclipse, but it was only visible as a partial eclipse in Australia. So what I've done for each of these shots is I've just saved the link to the Photographer's Ephemeris web app. So let's just click over there and have a look at the circumstances of this eclipse. A few things to note about how lunar eclipses are displayed in the app. First of all, the timeline tells you details of all the different phases of the eclipse, and that those events are interspersed with other things that occur that may or may not occur during the course of the eclipse. So you can see here, for example, we have a penumbral eclipse starting at 4:30 local time in Sydney. This is back on the 21st of December 2010, and this is for this location in Circular Quay looking across to the Opera House. And at the time I have selected in the timeline here, you see 8:36. That is after sunset, just after the end of civil twilight, still during the partial eclipse phase. The partial eclipse started way back at 5:30, goes on till 9 o'clock. And there was a total eclipse that occurred, but of course the moon was below the horizon in this particular location, so we didn't see the total phase. You'll find that the eclipses are listed in the events here. So if I look at December 2010, down at the end, there are the times of the lunar eclipse there as well. And you can click on one of those and select it here too if you want to go to a particular event. A few comments on what the different phases mean. First of all, the total eclipse occurs between what is called the contact U2 and U3, and U stands for umbra. So that is the dark part of the Earth's shadow. Why is there a dark part and, by implication, a less dark part? The less dark part is this penumbral shadow here that goes on for the longest. And that's because the sun is not a point light source, it's a disk. You can see that if you look at it through appropriate eye protection, you'll see that the sun has a width in the sky. And so when you project the shadow cones that are formed by the intersection of the light from the sun with the Earth, you have the broader penumbral cone and then the narrower umbral cone. And totality happens when the Earth is lying in the umbral cone. Here in the partial phases, we have part of the moon lying in the umbral cone and part of it lying in the penumbral cone. And so that's why when we flick back to the photograph here, you can see that is bright. It's still in the penumbra, but it's much brighter than the part that is actually within the Earth's umbra. And so the shape of the shadow there is the shape of the projection of the Earth's shadow onto the moon at that point. And the two or the magnitude here, you see MU, that is the umbral magnitude of 1.257. That means that the umbral cone was 1.25 roughly times the size of the moon itself. So the moon would lie fairly deep in the Earth's shadow had we been able to see it here in Sydney. Here at 8:30, we've got civil twilight is coming to an end. We're still half an hour roughly to run of the partial phase. And you can see that this line here, this thinner blue line, that's the direction to the moon. And it's skimming just in front of the Opera House there at an altitude of 4.8 degrees above the horizon, roughly speaking. I didn't have my clock set on my camera when I took this, so I don't know the exact time, and I didn't save the exact location, but this is pretty close to what we did. So that's this first photograph. Quickly put this into develop mode so you can see what sorts of things were done to it. A little bit of a tweak on the exposure. I did a little bit of brushing down of the moon, trying to take the exposure down and pull the highlights down and recover what I could. There's a limit to what you can do with that. It was pretty badly blown out. So that's something to consider if you're going to be photographing a partial eclipse like this in a twilight sky. You may need to do a little bit of exposure blending to get the best result. Let's move on to the second shot. There we go. Okay, this is in December 2011, so the next year, and I don't know how many of you may recognize this, but this is a building called Vanbrugh Castle, which is just outside Greenwich Park, so right at the side of the prime meridian. The park is sort of mostly behind the camera and to the left here, and the River Thames lies off to the left to the north, so this is looking east. And here we have a moon low in the sky next to this building. It dates from early 1700s, I think. Excuse me, quite a quirky house built by Sir John Vanbrugh. And this is a partially eclipsed moon. And there's cloud in the sky, but you can see some cloud in front of the moon. It's a little bit hard to distinguish the cloud from the eclipsed portion of the moon right here. Again, let's just look at the exposure quickly. 20th of a second at f8, ISO 800, and at 300 mil. So this is on a full frame camera. It was a D700 back in the day. 300 mil, photo's been cropped in a bit, so this is not the original resolution. And you can see this is quite well exposed. It's a little bit busy, but it's quite nice to have the moon juxtaposed next to a recognizable landmark. And so what I would note from this, plus the previous shot, the Sydney Opera House shot, is that when you have the opportunity to put the eclipsed moon next to a known landmark, be it a building or be it a well-known mountain peak, you're going to have something that's relatively unique, because there won't be that many opportunities to have an eclipsed moon next to a known landmark. And that can really set your shots apart. It becomes harder when the moon is much higher in the sky, as we'll see, but here it's not. Let's look at the circumstances of this eclipse. So I'm going to copy the link that I saved earlier. I'm going to flip over. I'm going to copy the link that I saved earlier, and then I will flip over to the browser, paste that in, and let's have a look at this setup. So 10th of December 2011. Here's Google Maps loading up. It's gone into, because we're quite zoomed in here, it's gone into its little 45-degree angle thing. I guess that's okay. Here's Greenwich Park, as I mentioned earlier. There is the structure of the house. I'm going to turn it off actually, because you can see the alignment a little bit better when I do that. This is more of a overhead view on this particular satellite map. And you may be able to make out there is the little green copper turret, dome, whatever it was. Let's look at the photograph. There it is, with the weather vane on top, and the moon just above it and to the right. let's come back, and you can see that's more or less it. Again, I don't recall exactly where we were standing in the park, but I'm guessing it was somewhere around here, given the trees that we were shooting through. It was in December, so there's no foliage, obviously. Let's just look at the timings of the eclipse. This is another situation where the shot was taken around 4:20 in the afternoon. That is after sunset, before the end of civil twilight. So with a long enough exposure, the skies are still fairly bright. And you can see the moon is about estimated 3.5 degrees above the horizon. There was a total eclipse. Again, it was a slightly lower magnitude eclipse, 1.1 in this case. But it occurred before the moon had risen, in this case, rather than... oh no, the same as in Sydney. Yeah, so it had occurred before moonrise. So we make the best of it. If you're in London and you can't move to the right location to see it, then what we can do is we can capture the tail end of the event. And here we have the partial phase, or maybe we're just post partial and into penumbral, but it's still a attractive sight of that moon rising. Okay, on to the next shot. We're now in 2014. We're in Boulder, Colorado for a total lunar eclipse that occurred on the 14th of April in that year. A few things to note about this image here. This is taken more or less at the point of greatest eclipse. So this is as dark as the moon was going to appear in this location for this eclipse. And you can observe a few things. There's still a very clear distinction between the brighter limb of the moon here and the darker limb up to the top. And that is to do with the geometry of how the moon is passing through the shadow. It is a total eclipse, but we'll look at the magnitude. Let me flip over here and we'll see where we're at here. This is a 1.29 umbral magnitude for this event. So here we are, we're in Boulder, Colorado, April 2014, the morning of Tuesday the 15th, in fact. So I said the 14th earlier, but you can see the moon is off here sort of to the south. It's about 38 degrees up in the sky, and that's not too high. It's quite comfortable to photograph, but it's still pretty much way up there compared to most landmarks. So I just elected to do a longer telephoto shot just in the clear sky on this occasion. It's certainly not so high that you couldn't find circumstances where you would be able to place that moon above a landscape, but there are some other considerations as to how well that may or may not work, which I'll come back to. Here's the total eclipse. It started at 1:06 in the morning, so this is overnight. So the partial and the penumbral phases were the previous day on the 14th, but the total in this location, this time zone, happens at 1 in the morning to 2:30 in the morning. And you can see just from the duration, that's an hour and 20 minutes, the duration of the total phase is a function of how deep the eclipse is, i.e. the greater the magnitude, the longer the duration of the event. And the time of greatest eclipse, i.e. when the moon is sort of as centered in the Earth's umbral shadow as it's going to get, occurred at 1:46 in the morning, which is more or less when this photograph was taken. And to come back to the point I started on here, the brighter versus the darker limb, even within the Earth's umbral cone, one part of the moon will be closer to the edge of that than the other, and this is not, it's not quite like a solar eclipse where there is a perfect silhouette. It's more, there's more of a sort of a qualitative edge to this, gradual edge to this shadow, which you see reflected here. So this will vary from one total eclipse to the next, just be aware of that. A little bit quickly on the exposure. This was 1 second at f8, ISO 3200. I think I was setting it to f8 back in the day because I'd read f8 is the best aperture, it gives you the sharpest results. Of course, the price of using f8 is that even on this modest variable aperture zoom, which would have been at 5.6, I'm still losing some light, so I end up bumping the ISO and bumping the exposure time. And as a result, this is on a D800, this one. I've put this through some noise reduction because I think at ISO 3200 the noise was quite visible, and so to get a slightly nicer result, that's where we've ended up. But it looks pretty good. It could have been taken anywhere, so there's nothing location-wise that tells you where you are to observe this event. Now, I mentioned it's high in the sky, but it's not so high that you couldn't have juxtaposed it against something. If you were putting it against a mountain or landscape, the issue is that everything is going to be incredibly dark. So you're not going to see really any detail in that landscape at all. The better option might be to juxtapose it against an illuminated man-made structure, a building, a bridge, something like that, has its own illumination that will balance things out a little bit. Bear in mind, and we'll see this in a later shot, that a totally eclipsed moon is pretty dark. And one of the things that you have to contend with then is contrast. So if you have man-made illumination and the eclipsed moon next to it, there could be some contrast issues there that you will need to manage in how you do your exposures. Could be some blending is required to get the best possible results. Let's look at the next photograph. Somewhat similar. This is the next year, April 2015, and it is a partial lunar eclipse. You might be looking at that and saying, are you sure that's a partial lunar eclipse? And the answer is yes, and I'll show you why in a moment. It's quite interesting. Because it looks like a total eclipse. It's not that dissimilar to this sort of redness and brightness that we had here. A little bit paler, but you can see this is during twilight. So let's just look at the circumstances of this event. So again, this was taken in Boulder, Colorado. The town lies here to the east of the foothills of the Rockies and the Flatirons, Flagstaff Mountain, all these features around here. What I've done, I've tried to reconstruct, we were on this bobolink trail, I think, here in East Boulder at dawn. So this is 6:10 in the morning. And you can see here, we had a penumbral starting at 3 in the morning, partial 4:17. Twilight comes up, we get to greatest eclipse at just after 6 o'clock in the morning. Civil twilight starts at 6:12, and here we are at 6:10, so just a few minutes, couple of minutes before the start of civil twilight, and half an hour plus before sunrise. Camera is over here. The moon is this line here. On top of it, I've dropped the grey geodetics pin, which you can enable using this button here, and I've placed it in the line of where the moon was at this particular selected time. And you can see here down below we have the camera assumed to be 5 foot above the ground on top of a tripod, sort of a reasonable default assumption. And there is the sight line along this path. And as you can see, the moon is sitting just above this peak around here. That's the peak there. If you watch just watch the little marker as I match that up in the sightline chart, and the little crosshairs identifies the corresponding place on the map just above. And so if we flick back to the photograph, you can see that that's pretty consistent with what we were looking at there. The moon is sat just above the top of this ridge line here. And let's go back to the main point, which is, yes, this is a partial eclipse, and there's the proof. It's the umbral magnitude doesn't quite reach 1, but it's almost 1. So it's you round it up, it's going to be 1. So it looks pretty much like a total lunar eclipse. It has many of the same qualities of a total lunar eclipse, except that this limb here is just not obscured. I mean, very, very fractional amount, but it's pretty bright on that side where it's closest to the interface of the umbral and the penumbral shadow cone. So this again, you can juxtapose it. You may remember on that previous shot, which was at 1 o'clock in the morning, I said a total lunar eclipse against the landscape is difficult. Now, this is not what I would call a great foreground. This happens to be the part of the Front Range on the foothills of the Rockies, but it's not terribly interesting visually. It's about the best we could get in the location we had for that eclipse. But you can still see how dark that is. It's still very dark. So that's why it's often better to get man-made illuminated objects to juxtapose with your eclipsed moon. Next photo. Here we are in 2015, September the 27th, and this is taken during a total lunar eclipse. It was, I think, one of the first ones that the media really grabbed hold of and started pitching as the blood supermoon, if you can believe that. What does a blood supermoon really mean? What it means is that it's a full moon. By definition, you can only have a total lunar eclipse at full moon, and it's total eclipse, it's red, hence blood, and finally it's at perigee, which is the supermoon part, which means that in terms of the variation in the distance between the Earth and the moon, that everything lines up in this particular case to have the moon near to Earth, and when it's at its nearest in each cycle, that is called the perigee. So this is a perigee total lunar eclipse. And what we have here is this is taken down in Denver. This is the state capitol building, and you can see that, as I mentioned previously, that when you have an artificially illuminated building next to a totally eclipsed moon, you can see that it's still pretty dark compared to this. So there's quite an exposure difference, a large contrast difference between the brightest points on this building, around here and up here, versus the darkest areas in the moon. And this took a little bit of adjustment even in post to try to brighten up what's there of the moon. I've made some brush adjustments to enhance that a little bit. First on the exposure, this was taken on Alice took this one, I think. I didn't take this one. This was on a D200 at ISO 1000, 7.1, 1 second at 220 mil. And the 220 here is really a compositional device. You can see this has been cropped a little bit, but not very much. To get enough of the building in for it to make some sort of compositional sense. If you go too tight on the building, there's not enough there for the eye to really sort of make sense of what it's looking at, even though it would, of course, make the moon somewhat larger in the frame. Let's look at the circumstances of this eclipse briefly. Here's the setup, 27th September 2015. That is the state capitol building in Denver. We have the camera positioned here. I've typed in here the height of the top of that dome is 180 feet. And that applies to the grey pin. This is the geodetics pin enabled over here, which I've put in. And you can see that at this particular time, let's have a look where we are on the timeline here. This is 9:10 in the evening. The total eclipse had passed its greatest point, but was still going on for another 12 minutes or so. And it was a magnitude 1.27 eclipse, so a reasonably deep eclipse, which is what you would expect, in fact, with a perigee moon, because obviously the closer the moon comes to Earth, the more likely it is to end up deeper in the shadow of the Earth. It's just like walking into the shade of a large building. The closer you get to it, the more shade you enjoy. So that's the relationship between the perigee. You can see the perigee event happened there. And that only, that varies over 28 days from perigee to apogee, roughly 14 days. And that occurred a couple of hours before, and here we are in the eclipse, 9:10. Other thing to note, here is the sight line from camera to the top of the state capitol dome. That's this grey dot here. That elevation difference there is reflecting the 180 feet, which is the height of that building above the ground. And then finally you can see this line here is the altitude of the moon, sitting a little below the top of the dome. One final thing I'll point out here, which you may not have seen before if you haven't zoomed in closely with geodetics enabled. When you get above a certain zoom level, we're now showing these alignment indicators, which are it's a line that is drawn perpendicular to the line joining the grey and the red and grey map pins. And the purpose of that is really to make it a little bit easier visually for you to assess in architectural photography when you are on axis to a building versus off axis. So for example, if I just take this pin and move it here, that would be an on axis view of the building. And you can tell that because this line is sort of parallel then to the building. So that's just a little sort of a little visual aid, if you will, that we show at higher zoom levels when the geodetics pin is enabled. And its purpose is for a quick visual assessment of the degree to which you are on or off axis to a building, which is an important consideration in much architectural photography. On to the next shot. I have two photographs of this eclipse. This first one is of the partial phase, and this was a lunar eclipse that occurred in 2019 in January, and I photographed it from a little bit north of town here in Boulder. And again, you can see this is 3/20th of a second f8 ISO 800 300mm, same old lens, on what was the camera? D800 still. And we've done a bit of cropping, some noise reduction on this, and it looks really nice. You can see a lot of detail in the moon. You can see just how much contrast there is between this upper brighter limb and where the moon has moved into the umbral cone. It's quite the range. And one thing to think about is when you're photographing these eclipses is focus. It's very easy to focus on a partially eclipsed moon, assuming you're comfortable with doing your autofocus or live view focus, or focus peaking, whichever technique you like. There's plenty of contrast that you can use to do that. Often it's better to focus, certainly on modern cameras, on something like that vertical edge, although the contrast here is bright enough that pretty much anything I would have thought would be happy with a horizontal edge. Some cameras, I know this is the case for the Nikon I currently use, the Z or Z8. The density of the autofocus sensors in the layout in the sensor grid is such that it often performs better on vertical contrast edges than horizontal contrast. So something to bear in mind, and might be worth researching about your own particular camera to see how it behaves best. And also do some practice. You can get out there in these nights leading up to this next eclipse coming up this following Friday and practice your autofocus or manual focus on the moon in the daylight sky. It's a similar sort of experience to what you'll be doing here for the actual thing. Here's the second photograph. This is the same eclipse, but it's a little bit later in time, and you can see this is in the total phase from the red color. And just look at the exposure difference. That's the main point I wanted to make here. Previously we were at, let's go back, 1/320th of a second at f8 ISO 800, and here we are 2.5 seconds f5.6, double the ISO 1600. So that should tell you immediately just how much darker the totally eclipsed moon is. Even though this still looks bright, that's a function of the exposure and the developing I've done on the image. But the amount of light that's hitting your sensor from this exposure versus that is a huge difference. I should work out what it is and tell you, but I'll leave that as an exercise for you to do later if you're interested. One of the consequences of that is that if you have anything marginal about your autofocus system and you were going to plan on relying on autofocus, it's much better to have got your focus acquired here during the partial phase than it is trying to do it here in the total phase, because things are just so dark. It can be much harder to get it spot on. So my tip would be focus during partial, check your shots, make sure it all looks good, leave it alone for the total phase. Let's just look at the circumstances of this partial shot first. Here it is, Boulder County. I mentioned this is in Colorado in the US. Photograph taken at around 9 o'clock at night, and you can see that the partial phase began at around 8:30 and the total phase will begin at around 9:40. So we're just shy of halfway through the partial phase. Knowing that information, look back at the shot, you can see, just inferring where the rest of the moon lies, that the timing that I've just told you, not quite halfway through the partial phase, is reasonably consistent with what we're seeing here. The penumbral phase, all of this eclipse, as you can see here, is occurring well after sunset, so we're in super dark skies. So again, if you were going to try to juxtapose this this moon with anything, even though it's really getting fairly high in the sky, you'd probably want to juxtapose it against some artificially illuminated building or structure rather than a hill, which would be pitch black as well. Let's go back and look at the total shot, and I've got the timing of that here as well. Just paste that in. And really the only thing that has changed is that we're now at 10 past 10, and that is the moment of greatest eclipse at a magnitude of 1.19. And at this point the moon is much higher in the sky, 57 degrees. That's really a bit of a stretch. So not a great one for wide-angle shots or juxtaposed shots, I guess. But a good one for telephoto pointing straight up at the eclipsed moon. This next photograph is not presented because it's a successful photograph. It's more of a record shot of a particular event. It's an interesting one in the sense of it illustrates some of the challenges that you may run into in photographing a lunar eclipse. This was a total lunar eclipse. Again, this is in looking towards Boulder, Colorado. There were the flat irons over there. It's taken early in the morning. Let's have a look at the circumstances. 2021 this was. So here we are, we're up on a slightly elevated piece of ground here just outside of town. There's Boulder, we're looking to the southwest more or less. There are the flat irons down there. We are at 5:04 in the morning at the start of civil twilight, which you can see from the blue sky. There's light available. It's a total eclipse beginning at 5:12, so when we're still in the partial phase. And it's not a super deep eclipse, it's just over a 1.0 magnitude. So it's an interesting sort of corollary to the one that we looked at from a couple of years earlier, where we had a 0.0 or 0.996 magnitude, just under being total. This one is just over being total, and qualitatively they look very similar, it has to be said. The challenge here, of course, is that the moon is descending, so it's sort of coming down a path, something like this. And unfortunately, as you might guess, what happened here is that it descended straight into this bank of clouds and was never seen again. If you recall from the earlier shots where I showed you the huge difference in exposure times between the partial eclipse and the total eclipse, you can imagine, especially as the sky is continuing to brighten, just how hard it can be to see a totally eclipsed moon in a brightening sky. And particularly if there's anything in the way of cloud in the way, it's going to make it really quite challenging. Now, next Friday morning, if you're in the UK or other parts of Western Europe, there is the possibility of photographing the eclipse as the moon is setting in the west, very similar to this. And in some places you can do it after sunrise. Now that seems intuitively impossible, that how can the moon be eclipsed if the sun has risen? And it's all to do with the effects of the Earth's atmosphere and refraction. and the phenomenon is called a selenelion. I think it's a very interesting conceptual phenomenon, a very difficult one to photograph, but I'm going to have a go, so we'll see what happens. And we have to hope that there are no clouds like there were this particular morning. Here's a wide-angle photograph. Again, this is located in Boulder. I'm up a trail, the Manzanitas Trail, and it's just to the west of town in the foothills. Here's the city, the university over here. That's the road going down towards Denver over there. And this was back in May 2021 at around sunset. And the moon is going to rise somewhere along here. Now, looking at this, do you think we're going to see the moon rise? It's a little bit hard to say, partly because we have cloud that looks sort of fairly well blended into the horizon over there. We also have the Earth's shadow. You can vaguely make out some anti-crepuscular rays here. I don't know if you can see those. It's hard to be certain whether the horizon is clear or not. Let me jump to the next shot, and you will see that, in fact, we were able to see the moon rise. This is just a few minutes later. I think it's 4 minutes later, and there's the moon just over there. And the belt of Venus, the Earth's shadow, is a bit more pronounced. Again, you can still make out these anti-crepuscular rays, and they all seem to be converging more or less on the moon, which makes sense because they illustrate that the moon, which is going to be eclipsed, we know that this is a series about total or lunar eclipses, is pretty much directly geometrically opposite the Sun-Earth system. So if you draw a line through the sun, through the Earth, and project the shadow out, the moon is lying in that. So it makes sense that these rays, which are coming sort of from the sun, are pointing towards the moon there. Let's look at the circumstances here of this eclipse. Here we are. There's one interesting thing which I wanted to point out. If I zoom in here, you can see pretty clearly just from the contour lines that I'm up on a ridge here. You can see the steep contours or the tight contours there. Here's town down below. You can see that in the photograph. You can see that we're elevated above the horizon. And this is where the adjustment for the elevation above the horizon becomes a little bit more significant. And what I did here, I'm going to zoom out and just show you this quickly. Let's have a look at the timing here. We're at 3 minutes past 8, and the moon rise is shown at 7:57. You'll notice up here that I'm showing a distance to the horizon of 31 miles and an elevation above the horizon of 560 feet, thereabouts. What you can't quite see down here, just because my picture's in the way, is just there to the right of the picture. It says horizon, actually says minus 0.46 degrees. It's a little bit hard to read there, but that's what that is. And I set that by clicking on the pencil here, and I want to adjust the rise and set times for the observer's height above the horizon. That is enabled, and I have an approximate elevation above the horizon, which I've derived from using the secondary pin. If I switch that off firstly for a moment and submit, notice that moonrise is now showing at 8 o'clock, and previously it was 3 minutes to 8. And that is because when you're elevated above the horizon, you see things coming across the horizon a little bit earlier. It's like that effect if you've ever taken off in an aircraft at the moment of sunset and the aircraft ascends, you can occasionally see the sun reappear. So that's what we have going on here. And if I enable that again, put that in place, this is where we worked out the pin was going to be. I'll just have to reset that because I turned it off. But it's somewhere roughly around here. I put it in the line of moonrise. Move it back. You do a little bit of trial and error to get this. And there you go. You see moonrise is actually at 3 minutes to 8. Now if I look back at this photograph, imagine if I couldn't trust the capture time in the metadata, and I look here at the position of the moon. You know the moon is about half a degree, so that's almost 1 degree above the horizon. except the horizon is not at zero. That's the key thing. The horizon is at negative 0.46 degrees because we are elevated above it and therefore slightly looking down towards the horizon. So it makes a slight effect on the timings of these things if you're interested in that. So one thing to note is that in that photograph we have a penumbral eclipse in progress at the time of moonrise. It started at 7:30. If I come back here to the photographs, and I'll skip to this next one, that's just a 280mm shot, slightly cropped again. That is that moon a little bit later. This is probably, I don't know, 5-10 minutes later than the previous shot. But you see this slight shadowing here on this limb of the moon. That's the effect of the penumbral eclipse. It gives it that sort of nice coppery, slightly dulled look. You can just see that we're rising through the belt of Venus, this transition from sort of bluish to slightly mauvish, purpley skies up here. So that's what we're looking at there, a penumbral eclipse. Now, here's the same eclipse slightly later that evening. And this is a sequence of photographs assembled in Photoshop. And it shows you really from the end of the partial phase here into totality, and then coming out of totality and back into partial. And as you might imagine, the exposures of these last two shots were very different from these exposures here. In particular, just how dark this one is at the central time of the eclipse. Let's just go back to the circumstances, check the magnitude. 1.4, that is the highest we've seen in the series of eclipses that we've looked at in this video. And a higher magnitude generally will mean a darker moon because it's lying deeper in the Earth's shadow by virtue of the geometry and its distance from Earth and so forth. So that's a sequence of those eclipses there. It's quite a nice thing to do, and you can sort of artificially reconstruct the approximate path of the moon through the phases of the eclipse in a whole variety of creative ways. So that can be a fun exercise to do, and try to keep things consistent as you shoot through the event, but adjust typically your shutter speed and ISO would be the two things you might change rather than your aperture, to keep a good exposure, and then you can adjust things in post. Arguably these are not ideally spaced in terms of the timing, but this was the best I could get from what I had that evening. This is the last in the series of lunar eclipse photographs that I wanted to share with you today in the video. This is from last September 17th in 2024, and it's a partial lunar eclipse observed in Boulder, Colorado. This is a telephoto shot, obviously, and it's cropped as well. This was taken with a Nikon Z8 camera, Z8, and I'm using the 100-400 with a 1.4 teleconverter for a 560mm equivalent. And that's a good length for getting a pretty decent resolution of the moon, particularly with the high pixel count on that particular camera. Just to look at the exposure information again, this is a 500th of a second, which is good given the long focal length. F8, which is as wide open as you can be with this combination of lens at 400mm, which would be at 5.6, plus the loss of a stop from the teleconverter, 1.4. And then ISO 500. 500 is a slightly quirky choice, typically speaking, but for the Z8 it works particularly well. It's when a certain sort of noise reduction sensory thing, which I may once have understood but no longer can quite recall, it kicks in and it gives you about the best sort of noise ratio that you can get on the camera. So that's the exposure. You can see from the histogram, pretty well balanced, not much needed to be done to this. Let's just look at the circumstances of the eclipse itself. Here we are, Boulder, as mentioned. We're on September the 24th, 2024, and I'm at roughly 8:45 in the evening. Very civilized time to be out photographing the moon. If only they would all be so cooperative. And this was the moment of maximum eclipse. It's not a total eclipse, of course, it doesn't have that reddish hue, it's partial, and the magnitude of the partial eclipse is also very small. It's 0.08, roughly speaking. So that's 8%, if you will, of the moon is lying within the Earth's umbral shadow. The rest of it is in the penumbral shadow. And the penumbral eclipse started at 6:40, goes on till 10 to 11 at night, and we're sort of right in the middle of it here at 8:45. So the moon was at a fairly convenient 17.5 degrees above the horizon. That makes it eminently suitable to juxtapose against the landscape or building, whatever. As it is, it was the first one that I'd had where I had this particular longer lens set up, so I thought I'll do a telephoto shot, and as you can see, it looks pretty good. This has had some sharpening applied to it in an external AI sharpening tool, which does a nice job, and that's zoomed into some ridiculous percentage. I'm not quite sure what, but you can see there's some good detail there for that eclipse, and a nice gradual shadow here. It looks very different from the sort of shadows you get just from different phases of the moon. That's how you can distinguish between an eclipse shot and, say, the moon at 20% illumination, or in this case, let's say 90% illumination, the corollary of the 8% eclipse, if you will. So that completes our review of these various eclipse photos down the years. Lots of different circumstances illustrated, some partial eclipses, penumbral eclipse, total eclipse, just total eclipse, total perigee eclipse, partial, total, etc., etc. And hopefully you've got a good sense from this sequence of photographs of how the altitude of the sun, how the brightness of the sky, and really your location is going to drive what it is you're going to be able to photograph successfully with each event. So think those things through, and then use photo ephemeris to really understand the circumstances of the eclipse in your location, and that will give you a good idea of how you can make a good plan and get some nice results. Thanks for watching.